Oh my god. That'd be for
Yo,
real.
yo,
Oh,
yo, dot. You still wanna talk about? You still wanna discuss, right?
We can just yeah, in a bit. Yeah, I want to get to the bottom of this first.
That's fine.
Bro, Seiba. Okay. Do you think God is goodness?
no, shut the fuck up. Let them talk. Shut up.
What? Okay.
No,
What?
Wouldn't even be
Okay.
relevant to me because supposedly if he holds to DCT, DCT is not a form of realism because they reject the metaphysical thesis. They reject the metaphysical thesis. So DCT is not a form of moral realism. It's a form of subjectivism or anti-realism. So,
No. That's false.
so it is. You've never picked up a book on meta ethics. How are you going to tell me it's false?
Yeah, I can tell you it's false because basically, the divine command theory, a dilemma. Some people deny it and they think that both more realism and DCT can coexist. So that depends on the guy's view.
No, they can't. You can't coexist because again, moral realism holds the three main theses. It holds the semantic, alethetic, and metaphysical. The metaphysical thesis says that moral facts exist independent of the preferences of any agent. However, under DCT, moral facts exist dependent on God's preferences and what God believes and what God thinks. So they reject the metaphysical thesis. So they're a form of subjectivism. You don't hold the most you'd be able to get out of DCT is relaxed realism, which is kind of just another form of anti-realism. But again, since they reject the stance independentness of moral facts, given that moral facts will depend counterfactually on God's preferences, that just means that they do not accept moral realism.
Yeah, again, that's just the DCT dilemma, but people deny it.
It's not
So
a
it depends.
DCT dilemma. It's literally how DCT is defined.
I understand, but again, it's a dilemma for those, for example, the theists who affirm more realism. Because back
Yeah,
then,
if you're a
so basically,
theist
your
and
argument. Hold
okay,
on, your so
if
like
you're a
your
theist and
argument.
hold moral realism, you don't accept DCT. If you're a moral realist and you hold to theism, you don't accept DCT. You might accept natural law theory. You might accept another form of normative ethics, right? But if you're a moral realist, you would not accept DCT if you're a theist.
That depends, though. Like some theists are not educated. Like that's the point.
They're not educated, but then that would just mean that they would be incorrect in holding moral realism and DCT. It just means that analytically you wouldn't be able to hold to the two, even if they believe, due to the fact they're not educated, that you can hold to the two. Actually, in reality, you can't hold to DCT and moral realism because DCT rejects one of the theses of moral realism. So again, it's a form of anti-realism.
Yeah, I'm just saying that some people might argue that both can coexist. Don't. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that's possible. That's not my view. I'm just saying some
Okay,
people will
that's
say it.
trivial. Okay, so that's trivial, but that's not relevant to what I'm saying because what I'm saying is that it's a form of anti-realism. Sure, some uneducated people who have never picked up a book on meta ethics and have never actually understood what DCT is might think that you can have the two and they can coexist. But I'm saying that given the definitions of both and given what they deny and accept, you would not be able to have the two coexist as beliefs within somebody's system, right? And so whether people can argue for it is irrelevant to me. That's obviously a trivial claim. People can't argue for the belief. But whether it's actually true that you can hold the two beliefs and they can coexist within a system, that's what I'm actually going after. So I don't even know why you'd make that statement because obviously it's a trivial statement.
Yeah, my whole point is like this is like I'm trying to sell this thing with Seiba. Like, if he thinks that DCT is true with moral realism, he thinks that both of them coexist. Then just educate him on it. Like, that's all.
Yeah, okay, but then why did you have to pipe up? What the hell?
What do you mean pipe up?
Why did
I
you have
come
to
to
say
like
anything?
I'm trying to explain that he can hold to moral realism and DCT, but the
You can
problem is that
think that he holds to them.
if you think that's a contradiction, then prove that's a contradiction, and
Right,
you'll
you
win
can.
the
Yeah,
debate. Like, there's no
we're not
point of saying
okay.
that
We're
he.
not debating. We're not okay. So number one, we're not debating. I was just asking him for his view. But I just told you that he can think that he holds to them. But again, given the type of theses that you hold, both of them hold, you would not actually be able to hold them to them in reality. So you can believe that you hold to them, whether it's actually true, whether it's actually the case that it is the case that you hold to them, or whether it's actually the case that you know that you hold to them. is a whole entire different story. And so I'm not arguing with him. I'm just interrogating him on his view on what he believes.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm just trying to tell you that his position, he can't argue for it. Anyways, yeah, Saiba, just answer his questions, bro, because, like, this is gonna
Yeah.
last forever.
So,
Okay, so you said you're a moral
yeah.
realist, okay?
Hold on.
You said you're a moral realist,
Hold
okay? Now I'm
on.
asking you what type of
Hold on.
moral realism do you hold to?
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to answer that question. You keep on talking. Like that was originally what I was going to do, but then obviously speaking, you and Secret had to get in. Be jackasses. Obviously cut me off. Obviously speaking, but also I do want to actually have a discussion with you about the DCT statement or just the proposition in general, and I'm wondering if you would like some form of talking stick so it's actually balanced out and I do not get cut off, so I'm actually heard good. Because I don't like heard at least like etc. So I'm just gonna ask if you would like the talking stick, yes or no.
Yeah, sure, we can do talking stick. That's fine. I don't care.
Yeah, all right. So yeah, sure. Okay, yeah. So I do believe you can actually hold to DCT while also suggesting some form of metaphysical thesis as in the symmetrical relationship with moral realism. Would you
Okay,
like to
so
know why?
number one. Okay, so before I can go on to your reasons why, okay, so I just need you to, understand this. So you do understand that the metaphysical thesis is just a stance independent thesis. Now, the stance independent thesis, or what stance independence means, is that these moral facts are true, independent of whether any agent thinks they're true. Now, let's get on to what DCT holds. DCT holds specifically that moral facts or moral propositions are true insofar as God believes them to be true, meaning that they reject the stance independent theses because to hold to the stance independent theses, you have to hold that they are true independent of whether any agent, so even including God, any agent believes that they're true, meaning again that they reject the stance independent thesis. If you reject the stance independent thesis, then that means that you are not a moral realist, you're an anti-realist, or you're another form of uh, a meta ethical view that just rejects realism. So again, you can't be a, a divine command theorist and also be a realist.
Not necessarily. So, like, I'll hold on. I'll answer this real quick. So, when you refer to divine command theory, obviously speaking, you would obviously accept or have some form of proposition which you hold the account to within a meta-ethical framework of obviously speaking about God, having the ultimate will, the commanding moralism, etc. Right. So, when I say moral propositions are capable of actually holding to some form of realistic stance or realism within the metaphysical thesis, I'm talking about inherently holding up within the universe because obviously they're reflexive of God's command because obviously both requires God's command to actually work. First of all, because the proposition in question that's being questioned needs God's will to actually be reflexive of the said belief held by God, if you were to say that, right? But due to his will, as obviously God, the qualities and etc. like capable of doing all things, this and that, obviously speaking, it would be willed through this that it's objective within that said thing. So when I talk about stance dependent, this and that, like what you brought up, I'm talking about like in terms of universe, like what happens to be within the nature of reality and the questions within this, like obviously speaking, the scenario or just like the framework given. So I hold that due to God's will, that there is some form of objective truth within the universe that holds towards morality in the nature of this said morality, obviously speaking. So DCT is capable of being reflexive in terms of truth due to God's will within the universe. I don't see why, because when you talk about stance independent, obviously you're speaking about the belief, about the proposition of it being true, right? That would what we be. That would. Oh, sorry, I'm stuttering so fucking much. It's been a while since I debated properly, but that would be what we refer to in terms of stats independent, this and that, not necessarily when we take it as truth, because what you're doing is that you're assuming that it's already true to accept like a stance in the like general. But like when we say that, we talking about the stance of if it's true or not, like argumentation for it being true and etc. So when you hold the DCT, obviously speaking, like I already gave the justification for that, why it's actually coherent. God's will and that reflexive stance and etc. with the propositions and as well, speaking why. And then also accepting the point about the proposition, the stance independent shit. Obviously, I made the distinction between God as an agent being capable of omni willingness into the universe. So I hold that within the nature of reality, not necessarily God, who is viewed within DCT as like this moral agent who is greater and obviously superior in that sense. More his ontological value is obviously superior towards ours, so that isn't necessarily being the grounding. So his the grounding for this nature of reality speaking wise. So like in any terms
Okay,
of the
yeah.
meta,
I don't
like
look. I okay. So look, I told you that I had to go. So I don't know why like you kept speaking, but um, you can repeat the things that you said before I left.
yeah, sure. So obviously when I'm speaking, what the fuck is going on? Okay, so obviously speaking when I said when I hold to DCT and moral realism, speaking wise, I'm just gonna go over this again. I'm gonna try and concise it this time, because like I said that obviously I hold that it's within the nature of reality, not necessarily in question towards necessary being, obviously speaking. So when you hold like
That's not DCT then.
yo, hold on. First of all, DCT accepts that God's command and will is reflexive within like it's just needed for the moral propositions in question. That's like the meta ethical theory. That would be DCT analytically
That's
speaking.
not just what DCT is.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead. You define what DCT is?
Okay, so DCT says that the truth of the moral propositions, so whether the moral propositions are true or not, are dependent solely on God's attitudes and on God's will, right? So imagine you had a scenario where, at one point, so time T, God wills or God has the attitude that, killing is wrong. And then at time T2, he has the attitude that, okay, not all forms of killing are wrong. Morality would be something that can change based on God's attitudes, based on God's mental states and mental attitudes, right? So that's what DCT is, and that's why I'm saying that DCT is a form of subjectivism. That's also what subjectivism literally holds. Subjectivism just says that the truth of moral propositions is determined based on the mental attitudes and mental beliefs of the agent, and that's literally what DCT holds to as well.
Yeah, so in counter, like just like counterfactual towards that point in like retrospect, obviously when we talk about the necessary being or God in question, obviously the one I would be referring to if I hold to DCT would be Allah, given that I'm a Muslim, right? So when we accept like things like qualities, like omnipotence, capable of doing this and that, obviously moral propositions exist within the nature of reality, and obviously
Okay,
within
yeah,
DCT.
that's not
Okay,
DCT then.
wait. Don't try and cut me off. Don't try and cut me off. So obviously, I'm not saying that's directly DCT. I'm making a
Okay, so then
more
it's not
so
DCT.
conjunction. Okay, hold on. No. Hold on. I make a
So it's
conjunction.
not DCT.
Okay,
It's literally just
no.
natural
Okay,
law.
you try. Yeah, can we try and like get like a talking stick here, please, and thank you, so he doesn't try and cut me off. Like I'm just trying to explain this dude's trying to cut me off. So I would appreciate a talking stick from somebody if they have perms. Uh, anyone? Okay, you know what? Sure, I'll just go on. So when obviously we refer to moral agents within DCT, obviously it also represents God's will, obviously within DCT, like what's actually explained within the conception, like what we should follow as God's command, obviously the morally great being, this and that, the virtuous being, this and that, obviously speaking. So in that like conception with omni will and etc. like that, if he's capable of willing into the nature of reality, we hold that more propositions are capable of being reflexive of like the truth, obviously
And
speaking,
that's not,
in terms. Okay, no, hold. You're not. Let me finish. So obviously, we hold that, basically speaking, it's reflexive of that symmetrical relationship between his will, the truth, and obviously speaking, the moral proposition in general. Both contains the will part. It's dependent upon the will, beliefs, etc. It's just the ground. God is the grounding for it. That's what I'm saying, right? And his will actualizes into reality for us to follow. That's like what DCT basically asserts when commanding the other moral agents, like if we should follow God's command, it's morally good and acceptable, this and that. Obviously, you can hold to an objective stance if that's the case due to the omni wills. That is what I'm saying. I'm not saying this is DCT. The point I was referring to was a conjunctive model.
thing you can't hold to a conjunctive model of DCT and moralism, given how both of them are defined. So under a moral realist view or under a moral realist view, a theist would hold, right? So that might, be natural law, or it might be another view, um, or like virtue ethics, etc., or deontology. Under those kind of views, moral facts exist independently of the beliefs or mind of any agent, right? So let's say that we have the moral fact or the moral proposition that killing is wrong or murder is wrong. God knows that moral fact, and then He tells us or commands us to not do that moral fact, right? Now that's a non-DCT form of realism. Now, the reason why I'm saying that DCT would not be compatible with realism is specifically because in DCT, it's not just the case that God knows these stance independent moral facts and then He wills them. It's the case that the moral facts are just products of His will. However, under a non-DCT view, moral facts aren't products of His will. Now, obviously, if you were to be a moral realist, you have to hold that moral facts aren't products of anybody's will. So not even God's will. They can't be products of God's will. They just exist independent of anybody's will, right? So moral realists would take a similar stance to, mathematical truths. So they'd say that mathematical truths aren't just true because they're willed by God. However, mathematical truths are true because they have some objective basis in reality. However, a DCT view would say that, these objective truths, quote unquote, aren't true because they have some objective basis in reality. They're true because some agent, or specifically God, would will them into reality. However, willing something into reality and simply just saying that, or simply just commanding a set of agents to do that thing which already has a basis in reality, are two different things. And so the moral realist position would not be able to be held in a conjunction with the DCT position. It would just be a contradiction. And so the position you are articulating, if you're saying that, okay, God wills like these objective truths into reality, right, would not be moral realism because they have to exist independent of whether anybody wills them into reality. They just exist. They just exist eternally. They're fundamentally grounded in the nature of reality. There's not a point where they're willed by any agent. They exist independent of any agent's will, any agent's mental attitudes or beliefs.
Yeah, so am I okay to respond now, or are you still going?
Start speaking.
Okay, I'm just making sure, because obviously someone can take a breather and etc. But yeah. So when you hold like, obviously in the case of the model, realism just asserts, obviously speaking, within some form of metaphysical thesis framework, right? Obviously speaking, that they're real, right? But that's also just assuming that would be prior to God. If God is supposed to be a necessary being, the necessary grounding for reality, but these things are prior towards God, and these things are reality, existing things.
We're not
That
saying
means,
they're prior to
oh,
God.
okay, hold on. Wait, what'd you say?
Nobody's saying that they're prior to God. We're saying
Okay,
that they're
hold
not
on.
posterior to God. But saying that they're not posterior to God is not the same thing as saying that they are prior to God.
Yo, hold on. So, you think you could just go ahead and define what posterity is?
Okay, so posterior means that it's ontologically after or logically after God's some action or some will that God has. However, the moral realists would not hold to this. They hold that there is no ontological priority or posteriority. They just exist like not interdependently, but they just exist as like at the same ontological beginning. If you want to articulate it like that, there's not a point where one predates the other or one comes after the other. It just exists simultaneously in a sense. And a DCT theory wouldn't hold to that. A DCT theory would say that the moral facts are posterior to God's will, that reality is created, right? And then God wills these moral facts and He can change the truth of the moral facts.
Okay, so first of all, like obviously speaking, the specific type of wait, I'm not even about the specific type, but Moriel just like I don't think there's any type of like prior, just like beginning, like same ontological beginning. Because like obviously speaking, to actually hold moral truths are objective, you need reality in the first place. That would hold that reality would have some form of beginning in itself, unless you are stating that moral truths still exist at the beginning of reality. In that
But we're
sense,
saying
of
that
like
moral truths exist simultaneously with God. So again, moral realists would take like a
simultaneously with
same
God.
view of they take a same view of moral truths as they do with logical and mathematical truths. Is they'd hold that it's metaphysically impossible for God to change logical truths, or metaphysically impossible for God to change mathematical truths. They'd also hold that it's metaphysically impossible for God to change moral truths because moral truths have a similar nature to things like logical and mathematical truths. However, under a DCT theory, moral truths do not have a similar nature to logical and mathematical truths, and they can be changed, which would contradict the moral realist theory.
Yeah. So obviously speaking, when you talk about like, okay, hold on. So hold on, can I ask you a question? Do you hold that moral truths are like coextensive with like reality, or like they're capable of being within reality, like some form of like
Yes, I
metaphysical?
hold. Yes, I just told you I hold to robust moral realism. So I think that moral properties exist stance independently. They exist in the world. They might exist in a realm of abstracta, or they might be grounded in the natural world, whatever. But I hold to a form of robust realism.
Okay, if that's the case, and you hold to that, like when you obviously refer to moral realism, they're capable of obviously at the beginning, speaking wise, reality, right? If they
What
exist
did you
within
say?
reality, they are existentially contingent. You agree? Yes or no?
Wait, okay. I need to understand the question. So what does it mean to be existentially contingent?
Just dependent upon their existence. I thought that was like pretty obvious.
Okay, no, yeah, okay. So moral facts. Okay, so the type of, you know, moral realism I hold to says that moral facts, supervene on natural facts. So if there were no natural facts, then there are no moral facts, right? So
Okay, so
yeah,
that
moral
would
facts
obviously,
are dependent on natural facts.
yeah. So they're dependent, obviously speaking, and they're simultaneously existing with God. But God is supposed to be the grounding for these specific things for reality in that
Yeah, but
sense.
that's not DCT because you'd be grounding it because there's a difference in saying that it's grounded in God's beliefs and saying that it's grounded in God simpliciter. So anybody would agree that logical and mathematical truths are grounded in God's simpliciter, but they wouldn't say that mathematical and logical truths are grounded in God's beliefs because if you held to that, then you'd be able to hold that it's metaphysically or logically possible for God to will that contradictions can exist or for God to will that 1 + 1 = 3, etc., etc., right? But we say that okay, they're grounded in God's we say they're grounded in God, but we would not say they're grounded in God's beliefs or they're grounded in God's attitudes or will.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on. So obviously, like, I think there was a bit of miscommunication. Hold on. So when you when I'm speaking about DCT, I mainly like refer to the part about mortal agents following the command within like reality. Say for example, like moral truths. If they are capable of being existentially contingent upon like other things, obviously God in question, right? God is needed for these specific like moral truths. Like if you held that they're within, obviously the moral nature of God, obviously speaking the moral beliefs, moral things within the rational agent of God, speaking wise, I just think that the account would hold that God is still existentially there, needed for that. So in the first place,
Yeah, but
so
that's not
like,
DCT.
hold on. You're not letting me finish. So like, I say DCT mainly. Like I can like I still hold to that mainly. More so, the fact I'm talking about is like the active potentiality being utilized there. Like I actually hold to God that he has active potentiality, and I think God is capable of willing these things into the objective thing. Like obviously, he's the grounding for that being the case. So God is still needed in that sense. That's what I'm obviously referring to in that sense for moral commandments to actually be the case. Obviously, there's
Yeah,
truth within this God
okay.
being that sense. So that still fits like what I'm saying as like
No, well, no,
the
it wouldn't be DCT because it would only be DCT if it's the case. Because listen, again, anybody would grant whether you're a natural law theorist, whether you're a virtue ethicist, whether you're a deontologist, and you believe in God, anybody would grant that these laws or like these moral normative properties would be grounded in the essence or in the nature of God. However, saying that something is grounded in the essence or in nature of God is different from saying that it's grounded in the attitudes of God. Because when you say that it's grounded in the attitudes of God, that means that God can, these facts are malleable. So they're malleable centered around what God believes or what God feels like or what attitudes God has to these things, right? So for example, again, like the logical and mathematical truths, we wouldn't say that it's possible for logical contradictions to exist, right? God wouldn't be able to will that. God would not be able to like have a mental attitude that would then bring into reality that logical contradictions exist. And moral realists would hold that moral facts are similar to logical facts and mathematical facts, such that just because an agent wills, even if that agent is God or omnipotent, or omniscient, just because an agent wills that these facts become objective, it's not actually the case that they can become objective, right? That's all I'm saying. And obviously, to hold to DCT, you wouldn't just have to say that they're grounded in God's essence. You'd have to say that it's grounded in God's mental attitudes and mental states, right? So those are two distinct claims. So if you're just saying that DCT holds that they're grounded in God and God's essence, that's not actually DCT. That's just a trivial claim.
Okay, hold on. So obviously, speaking when I say moral essence and etc., like the nature, moral nature of God, obviously you would still need the moral nature of God to actually have like moral expressions within the rational nature. You would need some form of moral nature to
Was
actually
on
have
his
that.
mental attitudes.
Hold on. So can I ask you a question? If these are
Hmm.
things that God, etc., and these are more so moral things which obtain to God, right? Do you agree God would have some form of moral nature? Yes or no?
Okay. Whether he has a moral nature is distinct from whether he has a mental attitude towards those things.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it
yeah.
can
What
be
I'm saying.
grounded,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
it
Hold
can
on.
be
Hold on.
grounded in God's nature, but that doesn't matter. It wouldn't be
Yeah,
DCT.
what I'm saying is that you would need the fact of God's moral nature to actually hold that. That's what I'm
And no,
saying.
nobody's disagreeing with that. Nobody's disagreeing with the fact that you can have facts grounded in God's nature. What we're disagreeing with the fact that what we're disagreeing is that whether these facts, can be malleable, whether these facts are dependent on God's beliefs or on God's mental attitudes. We'd say that they're not dependent on God's mental attitudes, right? So, for example, again, I'll just give a logical contradiction example. Imagine one day, like let's just stipulate one day that God wills it that like there was to be a logical contradiction or that the law of non-contradiction would be false. We say that's impossible for him to do, given the fact that these logical truths are objective and exist independent or are true independent of whether any agent, including God, wills them or believes them to be true. So even if like even if the existence of these logical facts are dependent on God, the existence of the logical facts being dependent on God is different from the existence of them being dependent on his attitudes, right? Just like a similar thing is that let's say that I have an eye and I say that okay my eye depends on my body, right? My eye depending on my body is different from me saying that my eye depends on my mental attitudes, right? I can't just think that okay I don't want an eye anymore and my eye disappear. That wouldn't be the case. I'd actually have to carry out the action of cutting off my eye to to carry that out, right? So that's basically what I'm saying.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say this real quick. If God holds moral stances, etc., obviously as a rational agent being, but you need moral nature to actually hold to this, and you need God in the first place to actually have that applicability for nature that is still dependent upon God, right? And
Yeah,
don't
it's
cut me off
dependent
because
on
I'm
God, but that's not
yeah, I'm
DCT.
still continuing, bro. Come on, chill out.
DCT.
I just off.
It's not DCT.
DCT.
You're not arguing for any. You're not arguing for DCT. You're not arguing for DCT.
You
Again,
just keep
a
playing. I'm
voluntarist or
trying
a
to.
non-voluntarist view does not hold to this. A
Hold
voluntarist or a non-voluntarist view would hold that the moral facts depend on God's moral attitudes, and they're also malleable. Not just that they depend on God. Obviously, anybody would grant that any fact in reality would either counterfactually or metaphysically be grounded in God's nature and God's essence. Whether that's the same as saying that they're grounded in his beliefs, grounded in his attitudes, or he can just choose to will these logical impossibilities or metaphysical impossibilities is an entirely different story. And so again, you're just talking past me. You're not actually arguing for DCT. You're just arguing for a view of theism that anybody would hold to, that anybody would hold that all facts that are true are grounded within God's nature or grounded within God's essence. That's not arguing for DCT. DCT makes a distinctive claim.
So DCT literally claims that moral commands are from God, we should follow because obviously objective from God, right? Obviously, if that's the case, that DCT holds to that, obviously speaking, moral commands from God should be followed because objectively from God, the morally virtuous being, moral stances, beliefs, etc., speaking wise, and we need God for that grounding. Obviously speaking, God is needed for these moral truths to be held. That's what I'm saying. Hold on. Don't cut me off this time because I'm going to continue. Don't cut me off. Shut up. Okay?
You
So
just talk.
yeah, hold on, shut up. So basically, what I'm saying is that, obviously speaking, if God is needed for these moral truths, DCT holds that to actually have any objective moral command and what we should follow, moral truths still need God. If his mental expressions still need God in the sense of his moral grounding and moral nature, obviously speaking,
So you agree
God
that man?
still
Okay, so you
need.
agree that
Okay, hold on,
well, no. So
hold on.
you agree that wait. Let me just ask you a question real quick. So you agree that okay, God can will these. Okay, so for example, God can change His moral commands. Like He can will different moral facts or moral commands into existence in different possible worlds, right? So let's say that we have world one, and God wills in that world that He wills like any moral fact in that world. Then He wills like a similar moral fact in another world. However, it's distinct, right? Both of them hold the same like level of level of like morality, but one of them distinct from the other in a different possible world. However, you can't do that with things like actual objective facts, like logical facts. You can't have one world where you will modus ponens is true, and have another world where you will that modus ponens is not true or it's not a valid inference. No, modus ponens is consistent across all possible worlds, and that's what a moral realist would hold to. A moral realist would hold that these objective truths are not the type of truths that can change via possible worlds, or that are malleable just because a being, no matter how morally virtuous that being is, can just change them. So again, it would not be moral realism. You're not arguing for DCT either.
Okay, so again, like speaking, obviously this would be taken into the stance of the effective of the pure actuality. Pure actuality experiences the invocation here. So if that's the case, God would be willed as the necessary fact across all possible worlds, because that obviously be a descriptor towards a set, obviously grounded within the obvious description of moral nature, right? Yo, can people stop the sound words, please and thank you. So what I'm saying is that, obviously speaking, God's nature is identical to his being. That's basically the invocation here for what I am saying. If obviously moral expressions, etc., are grounded within the moral obvious nature of God, right? At the potentiality is more so similar in this case to pure actuality, because God is the actualization and such like that. He's what's derived to be the case, necessary thing. Obviously, that's the case from what is being described here towards the more realistic thing you're holding to. That would be some form of necessary thing or metaphysical necessity. Like, sure, yeah, I like hold to that, but like the whole point about DCT is that it's still going to be dependent upon God. You need God for God, obviously speaking. That's like the whole
Yeah,
point I
but
made
okay,
with
would it be dependent on God's attitude? Okay, let's just illustrate the distinction between two of these situations, because again, you're just talking past me. It doesn't actually seem that you're actually tracking or grasping anything that I'm saying. So let's make a distinction between these two situations. Do you think that it's possible that if God has a mental attitude and he wills, for him to stop existing, do you think that it's possible that he stops existing?
that would obviously be a fucking contradiction, which is
Okay,
what
now,
I'm saying.
no, now
Okay,
let's
hold on.
no. Okay, now let's go on to the next example. Do you think that it's possible for God to will or have the mental attitude towards, changing a moral fact or removing a moral fact or changing like the way that moral facts apply to reality? Do you think you can do that?
Okay, you know what? First of all, I'm gonna give some exposition which
Wait,
is
okay, so
needed
you
to
know you
actually.
didn't answer the question.
I'm gonna
Wait,
give
you
some
didn't answer the
exposition
question.
which is
Okay,
needed
so
to answer the
you didn't
question.
answer the
I'm
question.
giving
No,
exposition which is needed to answer the
it is you
question.
didn't answer the question.
Holy shit, yeah. So I'm gonna give some exposition and then answer the
Yes,
question as
you
well.
didn't
Which
answer
is
the
what
question.
is needed
It's a
because
yes or no
obviously you're not
question. It's
understanding
either
what I'm
yes,
saying.
it is possible, or no,
No,
it
no,
isn't
no. Hold
possible.
on, hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on.
It's a
Because
yes or no
obviously,
question.
once I give exposition, because you're not tracking clearly the part
It's a
which, like,
yes or no question.
obviously speaking, like the whole point about what I'm mentioning is that like you can actually hold it under the pure actuality thing. The pure
It's a yes
actuality
or no
holds that
question.
God. Okay, hold on. Yeah. Oh,
It's a yes or no
I'm
question.
giving exposition to try and answer
It's a
because you're
yes
not
or no
tracking
question.
what is being suggested, bro.
It's a
Like,
yes or
holy
no
shit.
question.
So
It's a
hold
yes
on,
or
hold
no
on.
question.
You know what? Let me redefine DCT for you.
Okay,
Okay.
so now you're gonna okay. So I already told you that maybe you have some idiosyncratic definition of what DCT is, but that's not actually philosophically what DCT is. It doesn't fall into a voluntarist view. It doesn't fall into a non-voluntarist view. It doesn't fall into any view of DCT. It's just not DCT. You're taking is not DCT, it's a trivial view held by most people that all facts are grounded in God. Now, I already told you that whether all facts are grounded in God is the same proposition as all facts are grounded in God's will is different, because obviously it's not the case that all facts are grounded in God's will, given the fact that there are some facts, there are some propositions that God can't actually will or God can't actually change. Now, I'm saying that a moral realist would hold to a similar position. Moral realists believe that moral facts hold the same type of objectivity that logical facts hold to. So moral facts are type of facts that cannot be changed, that can't be malleable, etc., etc. So if that is the case, then that means that a DCT view is incompatible. Even this quote unquote DCT view you're presenting is not compatible with like a moral realist view, because a moral realist view would hold that they're not dependent on God's will. Just like we hold that logic is not dependent on God's will, just hold that mathematics is not dependent on God's will, but on God's attitudes. Again, like you're just talking past me. We're not actually getting anywhere, so I'm just gonna save the recording.